On April 27th, 2026, a 30-foot piece of decorative stonework fell off 291 Broadway in Tribeca and landed in the street below. It cut through the protective netting, it tore apart the wooden awning, it crushed cars in the bike lane, it put a driver in the hospital, and according to a source inside the New York City Department of Buildings, the facade of that building had been flagged as unsafe since 2012, 14 years. Through 3 full inspection cycles, multiple violations piling up over the years, a sidewalk shed installed to protect pedestrians from a building that has not been fully repaired for over a decade. And here is the detail that turns this from a building safety story into something that should make every New Yorker stop walking under a sidewalk shed and ask one question. The unit inside the Department of Buildings that processes every facade inspection report, every FISP violation, every unsafe condition flag for this specific building, the facades unit, is located at 280 Broadway, 4th floor. That is the building directly across the street. The unit responsible for tracking 14 years of unsafe conditions at 291 Broadway could see the building through its office windows for 14 years. And the stone fell anyway. So how does a 1910 landmark building on Broadway, one of the most trafficked blocks in Lower Manhattan, across the street from the agency whose specific job is tracking these conditions, accumulate a documented record of facade hazards, spanning 3 inspection cycles without ever getting fully fixed? But first, let's go back to when this building was supposed to be safe. This is 291 Broadway, built in 1910, 19 stories, located on the northwest corner of Broadway and Reed Street in Tribeca, Lower Manhattan. The building was originally constructed for the East River Savings Bank, one of those early 20th century institutional towers built to last forever, clad in the kind of ornamental stonework that was a signature of serious, permanent construction. Around its base, carved columns, medallions on the facade, stone detailing along the roofline. A building designed to project solidity and endurance onto one of Manhattan's most important commercial corridors. For decades, it delivered on that promise. It served as national headquarters for the YMCA from 1949 to 1980. Since then, it has housed commercial tenants, dance studios, and 4 schools serving children. 4 schools. Hold that detail. The building sits 1 block south of City Hall, 1 block from the World Trade Center PATH station, 1 block from the federal courthouse, on a stretch of Broadway that sees thousands of commuters, tourists, and workers on any given weekday morning. And directly across the street, so close that a person standing at the entrance of 291 Broadway can read the address on the building opposite, is 280 Broadway, the headquarters of the New York City Department of Buildings, the agency that exists, above all other purposes, to make sure that the stone on the outside of buildings like 291 Broadway does not end up in the street below. New York City enacted what is now called the Facade Inspection Safety Program, FISP, formerly known as Local Law 11, in 1998. It was the city's response to a history of people being killed by falling debris from building facades. A college student in 1979, a large section of brick wall on Madison Avenue in 1997, a 2-year-old in 2015, a woman named Erica Tishman in 2019. FISP requires that every building in New York City taller than 6 stories have its exterior walls professionally inspected by a qualified exterior wall inspector, a licensed architect or engineer, every 5 years. After each inspection, the inspector files a report with the DOB classifying the building's condition. 3 possible designations: safe, no deficiencies, no action needed until the next cycle. Swamp, safe with a repair and maintenance program. Conditions not immediately hazardous, but requiring repair before the next inspection cycle. If a swampy condition is not corrected before the next cycle's deadline, it automatically upgrades to unsafe. Unsafe. Hazardous conditions posing immediate danger to public safety. The building owner must install public protection, a sidewalk shed, netting, or fencing, immediately. Repairs must begin within 30 days. Extensions can be requested in 90-day increments, every 5 years. 3 designations. 1 unit inside the DOB that processes the reports, issues the violations, and tracks whether buildings with unsafe designations have actually been fixed. That unit's address, 280 Broadway, 4th floor, directly across the street from 291 Broadway. Here is what the DOB source told NBC New York on the afternoon of April 27, 2026. The owners of 291 Broadway have had a sidewalk shed in place for years. Facade inspections dating back to 2012 indicated unsafe conditions. There had been multiple inspections in recent months, with multiple violations piling up over the years. Facade inspections dating back to 2012. Let's understand what that means inside the FISP framework. The FISP inspection cycle runs on a 5-year schedule. Cycle 8 covered approximately 2010 to 2015. Cycle 9 covered 2015 to 2020. Cycle 10 began in February 2025. If facade inspections at 291 Broadway were indicating unsafe conditions starting in 2012, that means this building entered the unsafe category during Cycle 8 and remained a documented problem through Cycle 9 and into Cycle 10. 3 full inspection cycles. 14 years, not a new building, not a recently discovered problem. A building that has been carrying an unsafe facade designation in the official records of the New York City Department of Buildings for 14 years, with a sidewalk shed installed to protect pedestrians from that building for, as Tribeca citizen noted firsthand, at least 3 years, during which time there were no visible signs of active construction taking place. Plastic over the windows, netting on the scaffolding, the shed doing its job of keeping people safe from a building that was not being fixed. The shed was not a solution. It was an acknowledgement that the solution had not arrived. And then, on April 27th, 2026, the stone decided not to wait. Here is what makes the specific stone that fell so significant. The debris that came off 291 Broadway on April 27th was not random brick. It was not a loose chunk of mortar. It was 30 feet of decorative stonework, the carved ornamental elements that are the defining aesthetic feature of a 1910 Beaux-Arts commercial tower. Cornices, decorative panels. The kind of stone carving that is bolted and anchored to the building's structural frame using metal connections that, on a 116-year-old building, are made of iron and steel that has been exposed to 14 New York City winters, to freeze-thaw cycles, to the salt air that comes off New York Harbor, to acid rain, to humidity. When metal corrodes inside masonry, it expands. As it expands, it pushes the stone outward from the inside, a process engineers call spalling. The stone doesn't crack from the outside. It fails from the interior, invisibly, until the anchor gives way and the stone goes with it. This is precisely the failure mode that Local Law 11 was designed to catch through regular inspections. Precisely the condition that a qualified exterior wall inspector examines for. Precisely the deterioration pattern that an unsafe designation and a repair order is supposed to force an owner to address. The building had been carrying an unsafe designation for 14 years. The anchors corroded while the building waited to be fixed. The stone fell at approximately 6:15 in the morning. Reed Street at 6:15 a.m. is not empty. It is Lower Manhattan. The World Trade Center Path Station is steps away. The morning commute begins before 6 a.m. on the blocks surrounding City Hall, the Federal Courthouse, and the Financial District. The debris broke loose from the 15th and 16th floors, 150 feet above the street. As it fell, it struck the 5th floor facade, tearing off additional material. It cut through the protective netting and knocked the wooden awning off the top of the sidewalk shed. What remained landed in the bike lane and crosswalk on Reed Street. An Uber driver's vehicle was struck. The driver was taken to the hospital with cuts to his face. Mia, who was jogging through the area around 7:30, described seeing a long piece of debris, like the cornice of a building, lying on the sidewalk. She said it had cut straight through the netting. Within 10 minutes, Department of Buildings inspectors had arrived on scene. They work across the street. The same day, DOB vacated the building. A vacate order. Not just the damaged section, the building. 4 schools were inside that building. This is the detail that converts this story from a structural engineering failure into a human emergency. 291 Broadway is home to 4 schools. Downtown Dance Factory, Gaya Preschool, my little school, the Shirley Aninias School. Together, the preschools and schools serve approximately 100 children. Downtown Dance Factory serves more than 250 dancers who had recitals scheduled at the Tribeca Performing Arts Center within days of the collapse. When the DOB issued the vacate order on April 27th, all 4 schools were locked out of their spaces. Teachers arrived and could not enter. Parents arrived with children and had no classroom to bring them to. Dance instructors discovered that every costume for every recital was still inside a building they could not legally enter. The vacate order remained in effect for days. The facade stabilization work on Reed Street continued while recitals approached. Melanie Zrian, business director and co-founder of Downtown Dance Factory, told Tribeca Citizen, "My team has been spectacular. They have been working around the clock. The biggest priority is safety, of course. But we just keep saying we're going to make it all happen. Zoom classes for dance, borrowed rehearsal space from BMCC, costumes still locked in a building the teachers couldn't reach. These schools were tenants of 291 Broadway, in good faith. They signed leases on a building that was under active facade repair permits, surrounded by scaffolding, with a sidewalk shed installed to protect the people inside. The scaffolding and shed were supposed to make the building safe enough to occupy while repairs were underway. On April 27th, the stone cut through the shed. The system that failed at 291 Broadway was not designed without purpose. Every structural element of the facade inspection safety program, the 5-year cycles, the 3-tier classification, the mandatory sidewalk sheds, the extension requests, the violation penalties, was built in direct response to specific deaths. A student named Grace Gold, killed in 1979 by terracotta from a building facade. A woman killed on Madison Avenue in 1997 when a large section of brick wall collapsed. A 2-year-old child killed by falling debris in 2015. Erica Tishman, an architect, 60 years old, killed on December 17, 2019, when a piece of terracotta fell from a 17-story Midtown building onto the corner of 49th Street and 7th Avenue. She had been flagged. The loose material had been reported months before. The owners had gone to court to have a previous violation downgraded. The court agreed. The violation was reduced. The terracotta fell. No criminal charges were ever filed. FISP exists because Erica Tishman died. Grace Gold died. The 2-year-old died. The law was written specifically, precisely, and deliberately to create a system of documentation, inspection, and enforced repair that would prevent these deaths from recurring. 291. Broadway had been in that system since 2012. The stone that cut through the netting on April 27th was the answer to the question of whether 14 years of documentation, classification, and violation notices, without repair, is the same thing as 14 years of safety. It is not. The ownership history of 291 Broadway in the months before the collapse is its own story. The building was owned for decades by the Sutton family. Ely Sutton's Sutton Investments acquired it in December 1985 for $15. $65 million in 2019, New York Community Bank provided a $46 million loan secured by the property. By July 2025, the loan, by then held by Flagstar Bank, was in foreclosure proceedings. In August 2025, the building entered receivership. On December 23, 2025, 4 months before the facade collapse, the defaulted note was purchased by WMC291 Broadway LLC. The buyer, as reported by The Real Deal and confirmed in court records, was William Macklow Company, Billy Macklow, son of Harry Macklow. Harry Macklow developed 432 Park Avenue, the 96-story Billionaires Row Tower that is currently the subject of a $165 million lawsuit. The building with a documented 10-inch crack in its structural spine. The building with 893 defects. The building whose penthouse sold for $87 million and cannot find a buyer at $15 million. The father built the building, whose structural spine is allegedly cracking. The son bought the building, whose facade has been flagged as unsafe since 2012. He bought it in December 2025. The stone fell in April 2026. He had owned it for 4 months. To be precise, Billy Macklow is an established real estate investor in his own right, not simply his father's son. He did not own the building during the 14 years of violations. He acquired it in a distressed purchase from a lender who had foreclosed on the prior owner. But the stone that fell on April 27th had been working itself loose since long before anyone named Macklow had anything to do with 291 Broadway. The 14 years of violations were someone else's record. The collapse happened on his watch. And then the story gets harder to explain. The DOB Facades Unit, the specific division inside the Department of Buildings that processes every FISP report, every unsafe condition flag, every violation, and every extension request for 291 Broadway, is located at 280 Broadway. That is not a metaphor. That is the unit's published address, available on the DOB's own website and in legal citations across dozens of facade compliance guides. 280 Broadway, 4th floor, the same address as DOB headquarters, the same building that Commissioner Tagani was walking out of when he came to survey the damage on April 27th, the building that houses the unit tracking 291 Broadway's 14-year violation history is physically separated from 291 Broadway by the width of a 2-lane street and a bike lane. The inspectors who reviewed the FISP reports, who issued the violations, who processed the extension requests and the contractor citations, all of them could have looked out a window on the 4th floor of their office building and seen the scaffolding at 291 Broadway. The scaffolding they knew was there because a building they managed had been classified as unsafe. The scaffolding that the 30-foot stone cut through on April 27th. There is no single fact in this story that explains why 14 years of violations did not produce a repaired building. The extension process under FISP allows owners to request 90-day increments to complete repairs. Those extensions can be renewed. There is a legal mechanism designed specifically to accommodate buildings that require time to address complex facade deficiencies. What the law does not accommodate, what no law has ever successfully addressed in the history of New York City building enforcement, is an owner who keeps requesting extensions without ever completing the work. At some point, the extension becomes indistinguishable from indefinite deferral, and at some point, the stone decides the deferral is over. Here is the number that explains why 291 Broadway is not an isolated story. There are currently 81 miles of sidewalk shed in New York City. Not 81 sheds, 81 miles. A continuous metal corridor, if you laid them end to end, from Manhattan to the Connecticut state line. Each one of those 81 miles exists because a building somewhere in the city has been classified as having conditions that could injure or kill a person walking below it. Each shed is an acknowledgement that the building above it is not yet safe enough to leave the sidewalk unprotected. The majority of those sheds are not protecting people from buildings under active construction. They are protecting people from buildings that have been classified as potentially unsafe and have not yet been fixed. Some of those buildings have been under shed for years. Some of them have been under shed for more than a decade. 291 Broadway was one of those buildings, under shed for years, under violations for 14, under permit for facade repairs, while active work was largely invisible behind the scaffolding, and across the street from the building that was supposed to be watching, 81 miles of shed. 291. Broadway was one stretch of it, and the stone found the gap in the netting anyway. The attorney David Frickman, who has represented victims of falling facade debris in New York City, has publicly documented a specific figure. New York City building landlords currently owe more than $31 million in unpaid facade-related fines. $31 million in fines issued by the same system that issued violations against 291 Broadway, sitting unpaid, not collected, not enforced with consequences, serious enough to change the calculation for the owners receiving them. Here is how the calculation works for a building owner with an unsafe facade designation. The cost of fixing the facade, potentially millions of dollars depending on scope. For a 19-story Beaux-Arts building with ornamental stonework that has been deteriorating for 14 years, the repair cost is not trivial. The cost of maintaining the sidewalk shed, ongoing but manageable, tens of thousands of dollars per year. The cost of unpaid violations, accumulating on paper but not collected with the kind of enforcement that forces action. The calculation is obvious, and for years, at 291 Broadway and at hundreds of other buildings across the city, the result of that calculation has been install the shed, leave the building unrepaired, and let the violation notices pile up, until the stone makes the calculation for you. The fine structure that was supposed to make deferral more expensive than repair has not, in practice, produced that result across 81 miles of sidewalk shed in the most expensive real estate market in the world. The fines are $31 million. They are unpaid. The sheds are still there. And some of them, on some buildings, somewhere in that 81 miles, are protecting people from a building that has been classified as unsafe for longer than 291 Broadway has. Both things are true about what happened at 291 Broadway on April 27, 2026. The Facade Inspection Safety Program worked as its designers intended in one specific sense. The building had been classified as unsafe. A sidewalk shed was installed. A protective netting was placed over the scaffolding. An active repair permit was filed. The contractor was cited in March when the netting was found inadequately secured. The documentation chain is complete. The system saw the problem. The system put a shed under it. The system issued a violation when the contractor left the netting loose. Department of Buildings Commissioner Tigani was on scene within minutes of the collapse because he works across the street. And the same system, over 14 years, through 3 FISP inspection cycles, through multiple violations, through extensions and citations and contractor notices, did not produce a repaired building, did not produce a facade without 30 feet of deteriorated decorative stone that the netting could not hold when it finally gave way, did not protect the Uber driver whose face was cut, did not protect the 4 schools whose children were locked out of their classrooms, did not protect the recital costumes trapped inside a vacated building while 250 dancers scrambled for alternate space. The system saw this coming in 2012. The building on Broadway rained stone in 2026. The distance between those two dates is the distance between a violation notice and a real consequence. The Reed Street bike lane has been cleared. The facade stabilization work is ongoing. The vacate order was expected to be lifted once the emergency work was complete. The 4 schools are finding their way back. The recitals went on at borrowed venues because that is what people do. The violation that was issued against contractor Nova Construction on March 11th, 47 days before the collapse for failure to secure the netting, remains in the record. The 14-year history of unsafe designations, the multiple violations piling up over the years, the sidewalk shed that was there for years with no visible construction behind it, all of it is in the record. The record has always been there. The record lives at 280 Broadway 4th floor. And somewhere in those 81 miles of sidewalk shed stretching across New York City right now, there are other buildings with other records. Other unsafe designations from Cycle 8 that carried into Cycle 9, other violation notices, other extension requests, other netting that has been certified and recertified and cited and recited while the stone underneath it kept corroding from the inside. The Department of Buildings knows which buildings those are. They are in the system. They have been in the system for years, some of them for longer than 291 Broadway. The question is the same question it was in 2012 when the first facade inspection at this building came back as unsafe. When does a violation become a consequence, severe enough that the building gets fixed before the stone decides the answer? 14 years later, on Reed Street, we have one data point. The answer has not arrived yet.